So I'm Meg Story-Groves. I'm class of 1985 from Monterey College. I also went to the language schools and I studied abroad. I studied Zhonghua. And I've been working in the alumni office for my 14th year. And I am the Associate Vice President for Alumni and Parent Programs. And one of the things that we very much pride ourselves in doing is trying to find really interesting value-added engagement opportunities. And many times that comes down to academic opportunities like tonight. So we like to do more and more of what we call Big M or All M events, where we are spotlighting the various programs that Middlebury has. For some of you, you're very familiar with the former Monterey Institute, now Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. And some of you, language schools. We have some language school folks here. Of course, Middlebury College. And then we also have the Breadloaf School of English. We don't have anyone from there tonight, but we welcome them. And we invite parents and friends and guests. So we're glad that you're here. I think this is an excellent opportunity to show spotlight on a fabulous program, the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies out of Monterey. And we're really happy to have Philip and Cyrus with us. I do want to give a shout out to the women with the blinds in the back, Jane McCord and Riha Haq, who are incredible colleagues. When we want to do programming in DC, we're so fortunate to have this space available and their assistance in pulling it together to make it sort of a really excellent presentation. So thank you both. I also want to say that when I got into town today from Vermont, I left 70-degree weather. I love your 89. It's great. It's really comfortable. But I was on a Zoom call right before this with President Lori Patton, and she was talking to everyone in advancement. And David Gibson, the new VP of Communications and Marketing, was joining her. And one of the things she said, which was so apropos for today, was they recently did a bit of a survey with students. And they said, you know, how do you define fulfillment? And the students came back with 3 things that they say are critical for their fulfillment as a student. And the first one was a long-term mentor. The second was applying what you learn outside the classroom. And the third was to have some sort of long-term project or research. So when you think about that and think about what we're doing here tonight, it's just like perfect example of that. So, oh no, I need your bios. With that, I wanted to introduce, I don't have it memorized, all the good stuff that these two have been doing. So let's start with Philip Blake. We didn't know that was the proper pronunciation, although I'd love to know how that came about.
The password to get into the event tonight. The Blake people have been in.
So Dr. Philip Blake is Associate Professor in the Nonproliferation and Terrorism Studies program and a Fellow at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies, both at Monterey. He has been on the faculty since 2011. In 2012-13, he took a leave from his faculty position to serve as Senior Advisor to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense Programs. Mr. Cyrus Jabari is a master's candidate in the Nonproliferation and Terrorism Studies program and a graduate research assistant to both Dr. Blake and at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies. He previously worked at the Congressional Research Service, United Nations Office of Disarmament Affairs, and founded a startup that promotes student research and analysis on national security affairs. In addition to this project that they're sharing tonight, the two previously worked together on the chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons implications of emerging microfluidics technology. That work was recently published by the National Defense University Center for Study of Weapons of Mass Destruction and the U.S. Naval Institute's journal Proceedings. Please join me in welcoming Philip and Cyrus.
Thanks everyone for coming, and we have an unusual audience. This originally started as an alumni engagement event, and then we realized we might have something that the policy community here in DC was interested in, so we invited a select number of folks to join us. And actually we've got a couple of prospective students who are going to come as well, and I'm happy to engage all of you, perhaps particularly the prospective students if you want to chat after the event. So this is work in progress that we're excited to share with you, and in that context we're particularly interested and having some time for Q&A at the end. It's work in progress, but we think we have some really interesting things to share with you. Just to open, I want to draw your attention to the title because it's different than the title that you saw when you were invited to this event, which included the term biological jihad. And as you are no doubt aware, that term jihad has a multiplicity of meanings associated with it and is contested. And we think in many respects it was a good title for the project, and that multiplicity of meanings actually reflects the kind of spectrum of activity we're interested in, but it was also easy to misunderstand. And I think we've decided for now that our working title will be something that's a little less polarizing. This is a quote from the current Supreme Leader Khamenei of Iran that nicely captures the kind of a core dynamic we want to talk to you about today. This kind of reciprocal response or responding to threats with threats. We'll be tag teaming. So what we'll do is I'm going to provide you up front with a little overview of our kind of, in Pentagon speak, what we call the bluff, a bottom line up front, summarizing the kind of crucial insights. And then we're breaking the project into a couple different sections. And for each of those sections, I'll give you the bluff for that section, kind of the analytic insights that we distill from that. And then I'll turn it over to Cyrus, and he'll give you some sense of the kind of nuance and the evidence that underlies that. So we'll give you a little taste of some of the quotes, for example, that he has translated from Farsi or Persian so that we can work with them. And one of the reasons I'm really excited about this project, it kind of epitomizes the kind of work we do out in Monterey, including in the sense that it's this cross-language, cross-cultural project. And I am deeply reliant on Cyrus because I don't speak any Farsi at all. And he's got really strong Farsi language skills that he's been able to employ on this project. So in terms of the sections that are coming up, so first we'll start with a section we call fears, characterizing for you discourse within Iran in Farsi around fears, around biological weapons threats. Then we have a section on advocacy. So in that discourse, what people are advocating in response, what Iran should be doing and the discourse around that. Then we have a section on activities where we'll characterize for you based on what's in the open source, what we think Iran is doing, both defensively and offensively. And I should just emphasize right up front, the kind of value add in this project is on that first part. So we're characterizing for you a really interesting discourse in Iran about fears and about advocacy. We do not, from our seats in Monterey, have particular insights into, we have some into the defensive side, but on the offensive side, we don't have particular insights into what Iran is doing. And so those of you who work this portfolio will have deeper insights than we do. And those of you who consume the sources we do will have similar insights. So I just want to kind of caveat that right up front. And then we'll have two kind of final sections. Briefly, I want to talk about implications. So if Iran is doing what we think they're doing, and in particular, if they're engaged in offensive activities, how do we think about that? How does that matter? How do we respond to that? And then next steps. So Cyrus will briefly tell you, in terms of the project, what we're doing, what we're still doing, what we're interested in doing next. And then hopefully we'll have lots of time for Q&A, and we'd love to engage. I should note the presentation is being recorded, but we will not record the Q&A. So the presentation will circulate in some form as a recording. We haven't decided whether we'll put it up on the website, but the Q&A will not. And the Q&A will be Chatham House rules. In other words, you're welcome to take the information you learn here and use it in your work, but you shouldn't attribute it to either individuals or to an event here. So diving right in. So this is totally generic. That doesn't work. Maybe I'll try this. How do I go forward? Because the arrows are not. You know, I'm click. That arrow works. All right, so here's the disclaimer. So it's just us. It doesn't reflect either our current or our past employers or funders. You've seen versions of this lots before. So I'll spend a couple minutes on this, the bottom line up front. Iranian government officials and affiliates, and that captures a lot of actors, and we'll give you a kind of a taste of who some of those actors are, and many of them you'll be familiar with, and some of them you won't, are deeply concerned about biological weapons threats. And they perceive key adversaries as developing offensive biological weapons capabilities, but also as employing biological weapons attacks against them actively. In response to those fears, there's a discourse around how Iran should respond. And there is lots of advocacy for defensive actions of various kinds. And we'll talk a little bit about things that are actually being done in terms of biodefense in Iran. And then there's also some advocacy for offensive responses of various kinds. And we'll try to unpack that for you analytically. There's really robust open source evidence that Iran is doing various things, as one would expect in response to these very acute fears, to be better prepared to defend itself and respond to biological attack. There is some suggestive, limited open source intelligence that Iran may be engaging in more offensive activities, but that is analytically a more tenuous conclusion, and we'll unpack a little bit for you why that's a really challenging thing to assess in the public domain and actually in general, even within the US government. These developments have received relatively little attention, and we think a crucial reason for that is that this discourse, which is strikingly publicly accessible, is happening in Farsi or Persian. And so we have the ability to access that, and I think for a lot of analysts that is less accessible. I should just note here briefly that it's striking how much is available if you have the language skills to engage with it. And part of that is that Iran, like any place, but Iran is a less monolithic place than one might think of it, even for a place that has something called a supreme leader. And there is some pretty remarkable, it's a kind of a hybrid system of government, and there's some pretty remarkable, there's political contestation that happens in that system, and there's some pretty remarkable public discourse that happens in that context, in part in the context of that political contestation and for other reasons. And that's, I just want to flag that for you briefly, and that's the kind of thing that we can get into more deeply in the Q&A. So starting off with the first section, fears. So what do Iranian government officials and affiliates fear? So they allege that the United States and Israel, and you may be aware that often the US and Israel get lumped together, so they're not always analytically distinct here, but in particular these two countries, and to a lesser extent others, to include, interestingly, some European countries, to include, as one would expect, Israel, are actively developing biological weapons. And that they're actively employing them against Iran in various modes. They fear biological attack, and they think they have been attacked against government officials, military officials, the population broadly, their industry, their agriculture, and more broadly. They allege that some attacks may have occurred or have occurred. Some of the discourse suggests that people, for example, have gotten sick in suspicious incidents and maybe they were attacked, and some of the discourse suggests it is the case that certain attacks have in fact happened. Some of the fears that are expressed are more coherent and plausible, and some are more vague and or more fantastical and less believable. So there's a kind of a spectrum, and some of what's just a throwaway example of that, there's some discourse around external control of the weather, and Iran being attacked by the weather being manipulated, just as a kind of a throwaway example. So there's a spectrum of what's being alleged, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. These fears are predominantly expressed by conservatives, and we can get into the nuances of that sort of analytic category, and there's some pushback that we see from people we would characterize more as moderates. And I think it's also worth analytically noting that we infer that some of this is an expression of legitimate fear, but these actors also have other motivations to say the kinds of things they're saying. Right, so they may want to distract from domestic incompetence, right? They may want to avoid responsibility for mismanagement of the agricultural sector that leads to agricultural outbreaks. They may want to rally the population around the flag in a way that demonizes some outsider, and they may have individual and institutional motivations of various kinds. So I think it's really important not to necessarily take this at face value, but we also think that those alternate explanations aren't the whole, certainly we hope, in our project, analytically, we think there are some very legitimate fears being expressed, and one thing that supports that is the advocacy and the specific activities that we see in response to these fears. So I'm going to turn it over to Cyrus, and he's going to tell you a little bit about the kinds of people who are saying the things, very senior affiliates and officials in the Iranian government who are saying some of these things, and then he'll give you a little flavor of some of the quotes, some of the translated work on which we are basing some of these analytic conclusions. Thanks.
Sure. So there are various types of Iranian officials and affiliates that are engaging in expressing these statements on their biological weapons fears. They range from people who are at the senior leadership posts in Iran's military, both sides of its military. It's Artesh, which is mostly defensively focused, and it's IRGC, which has some legitimate justification in Iran for conducting offensive operations in the region. And then also in the Mejlis and various other government institutions, Iran's parliament that is, various media outlets and heads of those media organizations, as well as cyber-related organizations, elements of Iran's research universities, some that are IRGC affiliated, some that are not alleged to be IRGC affiliated or identified as that, heads of local emergency response and provincial emergency response that are either designated by the supreme leader or even those that are elected by the local populace of villages, cities, and districts. And then there are some independent scholars or just very prolific writers who have written many books on this subject of bioterrorism or biological warfare that is being perpetrated by what these many Iranian sources allege are the global arrogance, the Zionists, Western states, any way they'd like to color it. So I'll give you a couple slices of the types of things that they are saying. One is you see bio threats and biological weapons attacks being contextualized in a sort of hybrid warfare strategy that they perceive their adversaries as pursuing against Iran, or within various other contexts, such as these adversaries using different instruments of power to attack Iran or to constrain Iran's behavior, and biological weapons are one way of doing that. Iran also very much identifies or seeks to pursue a hybrid warfare strategy, and that little statement in the third quote about soft warfare, it's interesting because that's normally discussed within Iran as a type of warfare to influence the population of a target country and to break its will, and it's usually talking about propaganda and information operations in general. But it's interesting that biological weapons are now being thrown into the soft warfare category in discussions. And lastly, it's also interesting that it's being discussed within some other contexts, such as bringing people into a resistance economy. They could throw in a little allegation of biological weapons attacks by adversaries and then turn the entire discussion of a speech or of a Friday prayer to gathering people to build up this resistance economy and build demand for domestic products. So this illustrates that there may be very many motivations for talking about biological weapons and biological attacks perpetrated by adversaries. But there are some that specifically address biological weapons-based assassinations where they identify the perpetrators, most often pretty specifically as the United States and Israel, sometimes European states, Britain, France, even Germany, as being involved indirectly in these attacks. They also talk about Saudi having a biological weapons capability, Saudi Arabia, and attacking Iranian proxies or innocent civilians, as they allege, in many different parts of the world, particularly in the Gulf. And interestingly, allegations of the types of biological attacks that are being conducted and the targets are at some points very clear. They're made very clear, and there's some degree of plausibility behind these allegations. And other times they're very vague and very implausible. Sometimes they talk about targets as being Iranian leaders and government affiliates, their family members generally. And sometimes they talk about leaders of other countries or of other groups that Iran aligns with. Or they specifically mention scientists that were traveling abroad or themselves even as being the subject of biological attacks. And interestingly, they seem to conflate other forms of the chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear domain with the biological weapons domain in general. I mean, they say that Yasser Arafat and Khalid Mishal were attacked with biological weapons, and most open sources, most allegations in the open source domain point towards other types of CBER. So I'll turn it over to Philip to talk about advocacy.
Great. Thanks, Cyrus. So there are these fears, and we've just given you a kind of little taste of some of the specific fears that have been expressed. So what are people advocating in response to this? So again, I'll generalize, and we'll turn it back over to Cyrus to show you a little taste of some of that evidence. So Iranian government officials and affiliates advocate for defensive responses of various kinds, and that's not surprising, right? If they do in fact have these intense fears that we're documenting in this project, then it would make sense that they would advocate for various kinds of defensive responses. On the offensive side, I think it's really important to start analytically by acknowledging that there is a rich and explicit discourse in Iran that condemns the pursuit of, that rejects and condemns the pursuit of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. And obviously that has shown up in the context of, for example, the nuclear negotiations that led to the Iran nuclear deal, and discussions of how to interpret that. And in the chemical domain, as some of you may be aware, there's some interesting nuances, perhaps some tensions between past Iranian statements and past Iranian behavior. But we're, in this case, focused on the biological domain. And in the biodomain, like the others, there is a widespread rejection of the notion that Iran should do things offensively. And there is some discussion that caveats that. And there is some pushback on that. So there is some discussion that there are circumstances where the pursuit and or the use of biological weapons might be warranted. And we're particularly interested analytically in that discussion. In particular, there's a kind of a broader discussion within Iran, and this is in part rooted in Shia Islam, but it's also consistent with some broader Islamic discussions around just war and proportionality. There's some discussion that things that would otherwise be prohibited may be allowed if your enemy does them against you. And that discourse, we're really interested in that discourse, and we're interested in how it maps onto other domains, like cyber or IEDs, or we'll give you some examples. But there is some of that discourse that also seems to apply to the biological weapons domain. So we see some advocacy for offensive biological weapons activities if Iran is being threatened with biological offense, as we noted earlier, many perceive themselves to be, or if pursuing offensive biological weapons capabilities gives Iran some kind of advantage in the asymmetric warfare in which it has sometimes engaged. So again, I'll turn it back to Cyrus. He'll give you a little sense of some of the key actors. Hopefully you recognize at least a couple of these people. And again, he'll give you a little taste of some of the things that these people are saying.
Yeah, so again, there are many different types of people who are talking about justifications in a theological or in a strictly military sense, or the marrying of the two. You probably recognize the former Supreme Leader Khomeini and current Supreme Leader Khamenei, but there are also interesting figures that are very prominent in politics or were very prominent in Iranian decision-making and advisory to the Supreme Leader during the Iran-Iraq War and today. There are also clerics who have very strong opinions on just war doctrine, proportionality within Shia Islam, and talking about where weapons of mass destruction generally fit, or where biological weapons, and another term they use, microbial weapons, where that fits into Shia Islamic doctrine for war. And then there are some who, on the surface, have no clear political or military or economic connection to many of these actors, but are still talking about this stuff at universities that also, on the surface, do not appear to have any clear affiliation with the military. So to give you a few slices of what they're saying, there is this clear pattern that is consistent since the early days of clerics being able in Iran to talk about just war doctrine, to basically assess that proportionality is justified. A response in kind to an adversarial threatened attack or attack is justified. And this is consistent across the board up until the quote that we featured in our title, Khamenei saying answering threats with threats. And so that aspect is unsurprising. What is interesting is how that concept of proportionality seems to extend to domains or to pursuing tactics and strategies that are otherwise unjustified in traditional Shia thought. and traditional Shia rulings. And the justifications that they've derived for pursuing some of these tactics and strategies and capabilities is basically that they all come from verdicts and interpretations that are made by the supreme leader of the Velayat al-Faqih, the system of supreme Islamic jurisprudence, the system that Iran is today. So, one example is how they basically sanctioned the pursuit of assassinations internationally outside Iran's region, or the Islamic region, as they talk about it, Dar al-Islam. And then another interesting domain is even the cyber domain is discussed with theological considerations. But this logic and this discourse also spans across, talks about IEDs, whether or not proxy use of suicide bombing, such as Hezbollah in the 1980s, is permissible, rocket attacks, such as the 33-day war in 2006, and then supplying or proxy use of UAV drones and missiles and various other types of conventional systems. But what's most interesting is the discussion, for our purposes, of weapons of mass destruction in general and biological weapons specifically. There are vague iterations and formulations of how weapons of mass destruction are permissible if it's religiously sanctioned. There are other instances in which they discuss how weapons of mass destruction are permissible actually in specific cases that might not even require a verdict or interpretation from the Imam, the supreme source of emulation and authority in Shia Islam. And there are other cases in which clerical figures are even talking about where biological weapons are actually necessary in today's threat environment, where they perceive Israel as having biological weapons. There is no deterrent to stop them, and biological weapons would be an appropriate thing to develop in kind. And the person in that bottom quote, the third quote that's saying that, is a leader at Qom Seminary Theological School. He's the leader of the Islam School monthly journal that talks about many different military issues through an Islamic lens. And he appears to have some relationship with the former Supreme Leader Khomeini. Home seminaries where many future clerics are taught to follow in the footsteps of Khomeini. So it's interesting that he made that specific statement. So are they moving towards this stuff? I don't know if we can exactly answer that, but Dr. Blake will try to tackle that.
So we've characterized for you their fears, we've characterized for you the things they're advocating, and now we want to spend a little bit of time diving into this question of, well, what are they doing? Again, I just want to caveat that we have, I think, less that's incredibly novel, but this is an important part of the project, right? To then turn and say, based on those fears and based on this advocacy, what do we see them actually doing? We see robust evidence of Iranian defensive biological weapons-related activities of various kinds. And we actually think that's analytically interesting. It's not surprising. It's not shocking. It's not the sort of juiciest takeaway from the project, but we actually think that's interesting, and we have a lot of nuance, and we'll share a little bit of that with you in terms of what they're doing. We see suggestive but not definitive evidence of offensive biological weapons activities. I will note that the United States has for many, many years alleged in public settings, for example, in publicly available reports or open congressional testimony or other contexts, has expressed its concerns around Iran's biological weapons activities. I'll show you a little quote from a really recent report that kind of nicely captures some of those concerns, and other countries have as well, some of the ones that you would expect. I think it's really important to emphasize here that there is a kind of a fundamental challenge associated with identifying offensive biological weapons activity. And the problem is that it's extraordinarily difficult, maybe even impossible in some regards, but extraordinarily difficult to differentiate between offensive and defensive biological weapons activity. In fact, a robust biodefense program is going to involve doing some offensive things. We think the Amerithrax bomber, for example, came out of the US biodefense program, an individual doing some legitimate things as we would characterize them, and and was able to use that in an offensive mode. So differentiating offensive from defensive, as those of you who work on bio know, is inherently challenging. And then there's a dual use problem. There's a lot of things that have non-military civil applications that are very difficult to distinguish from, and in some cases actually impossible to distinguish from offensive activities. And when we show you a little quote from a recent State Department report, this is one of the themes of it, is that in addition to expressing concern around Iranian activities, the US government acknowledges publicly that it is deeply challenged in making these assessments because of the kind of inherently dual-use nature of bio. This is a problem across the nuclear, chemical, and biological space, but it is a particularly acute problem in the biological weapons domain. So I'm going to turn over to Cyrus, and he'll characterize for you some of the interesting evidence we have on defensive responses, and then we'll circle back to the offensive issue, and we'll frame that around the quote from a US government report that came out just last month.
So Iran's being very clear that it's pursuing defensive actions in the biospace. It has a biodefense program. The Parliament of Iran, the Majlis, has considered legislation, authorized legislation, and authorized funding for what's under those legislations for biodefense programs for at least 10 years. The Ministry of Intelligence, the RGC, a new organization called the National Passive Defense Organization. And when I say new, I mean relatively new, not present during the time of the Islamic Revolution and the Iran-Iraq War. These organizations all have some role in the biodefense program. They are tasked with providing the Majlis information on their activities to respond to biological threats or bioterrorism. They're tasked with investigating and conducting panels that appear to be almost monthly on biological weapons-based assassinations. And there are many other things that they are doing in this domain, but it is worth noting that those organizations involved in that space also have some involvement in offensive programs that we've seen. National Passive Defense Organization has had some involvement in Iran's missile program. It has involvement in defending Iran's nuclear sites. IRGC, Ministry of Intelligence, are self-explanatory. And these organizations are continuing to receive funding, continuing to pump out these fears, and continuing to create a biodefense program at the national, provincial, and local levels. So here's what they're doing. They're developing antidotes for biological agents. They are developing administrative responsibilities and oversight bodies at the national, provincial, and local levels. They are tasking IRGC-affiliated research universities with developing biotechnology to respond to these threats and to continue investigating these threats. And we'll get into some of the literature of what they're doing there. And they are distributing CBRN response equipment at many different scales across the country. I remember just a small thing, a family member of mine telling me that 30, 40 years ago, Iran had trouble receiving vaccines in some areas of the country that were somewhat accessible. Now they have CBRN response units in many parts of the country, and this is 40 years since the Islamic Revolution. And so what is being pumped out in academic journals? Naturally, when you want to evaluate whether a country is pursuing some sort of biodefense or offensive biological weapons program, you want to create a bibliography of what they're saying in their academic research institutions. Well, here are some journals from military-affiliated institutions, some operated by that National Passive Defense Organization, some operated by the RGC, that are talking about biological threats and how to defend against them. Whether that's looking at the agents themselves, looking at novel emerging technologies on par almost with what Philip and I wrote about microfluidics in responding to bioterrorist incidents and biological attacks, and even developing protective equipment and clothing for personnel. And many of the people writing about this stuff have testified to the Majlis, and they interface also with some of the clerics that are sourced in our future report. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Blake.
So what about the offensive side? So as I mentioned here, and I guess I'm probably caveating it to death, but I don't think we have any particularly novel insights on Iran's offensive activities. This is a quote from a State Department report. It's a regular report that assesses other countries' compliance with arms control non-proliferation commitments. So it's a global report that looks at various actors and articulates publicly a version of the kinds of assessments that we also see from the US intelligence community, for example, in open congressional testimony and otherwise. And there's a couple pages, this is a kind of a nice sort of summary quote, and there's a couple pages that this is drawn from in the context of this larger report. And I think the bottom line here is that from the perspective of the US government, and there's also interesting think tank work that tries to grapple with some of this, and so there are other governments that have contributed to this as well. There are significant reasons for concern. But there are also very significant limitations, especially in the open source. The same issues bedevil, presumably, and I'm speaking here only in a personal capacity and only based on open source information, but presumably the same issues bedevil internal classified assessments, though those have access to additional data streams, which is the inherently dual use nature of these technologies. And the kind of fundamental challenges associated with assessing the fact that these technologies have very low footprints, and there's a whole host of reasons why definitively identifying an offensive biological weapons program is really challenging. But certainly there is a lot of evidence, even in the public domain, which is consistent with and out of which one can tell, I think, a pretty plausible story that Iran may in fact be engaging in some offensive biological weapons activities. I think that's about as far as that would go based on what we know in the public domain. So what if they are? What if you buy what we've told you so far in the presentation? They're fearful, they're advocating for defense and offense, they're doing a whole bunch of really interesting stuff on defense. Maybe they're doing stuff on offense, though it's much harder to gauge. Well, what if they are? And in particular, what if they're doing things on the offensive side? Because I think in some respects that, from a policy perspective, that's the most intriguing question. It's worth emphasizing right up front that Iran would face tremendous challenges to developing a viable biological weapons capability. Part of the reason that we, the United States, got out of the biological weapons game is that we thought their utility was limited, and they have characteristics that in a variety of ways make them undesirable, especially on the battlefield. Part of the reason that we got out of the biological weapons business and supported what became the Biological Weapons Convention, the negotiation of that in the 70s, was because of some fundamental problems with biological weapons. And the challenges that we had would only be magnified for Iran. Iran is a place that would face much more significant resource constraints. They're heavily sanctioned in various ways. It would be really challenging for the Iranians to develop a significant biological weapons capability. Having said that, there are things that they could do. And if they did those things and overcame some of those challenges, it's also worth noting that biological weapons are particularly well suited to asymmetric warfare. So they may be much less helpful on the battlefield especially against more sophisticated warfighters who have detectors and suits and masks and the ability to manage that kind of a threat. And that's part of the reason that we, the United States, got out of that domain. But against undefended populations, against less sophisticated combatants in various kinds of asymmetric contexts, biological weapons may actually, their weaknesses or shortcomings may be less problematic, and actually some of the things that are weaknesses may actually be strengths. The fact that it takes a while for a disease outbreak to manifest, for example, may actually be a good thing in certain asymmetric contexts. So we just want to flag this because Iran is a country that historically has engaged in and supported various forms of asymmetric conflict. And so we're a little concerned if they are in fact actively doing things on the offensive side for that reason. How do we respond from a policy perspective? I think here the response is very generic. There's a sort of standard set of tools. For example, situational awareness and warning, right? Can we understand what they're doing? And can we understand when what they're doing changes? And that's something that in our small way, we're hoping to contribute to through this project, to kind of get more insight into the conversations within Iran and related to that, the activities that might follow from those conversations. There are various ways in which we could constrain the United States, working together with others, could constrain an Iranian offensive biological weapons program if there were one. For example, export controls, and there are other ways in which one might seek to constrain. Obviously, in the nuke, chem, and bio domain and other domains, there are interesting, in some cases very creative ways in which the United States has sought to constrain Iran. And we could build our own response and consequence management capability, and maybe even more importantly, build others' capability. So we could help regional actors who might be subjected to attacks, for example, to better prepare themselves to cope with this kind of threat if it were to emerge. What about next steps? So we're going to close here. So Cyrus will tell you briefly about where we're going with the project, what we're interested in exploring further, and then we're really eager to open it up for both questions and comments.
So clearly we've come across a lot of evidence of these fears and these justifications or advocacy, but it is particularly worth exploring what Iran is saying about actions in other domains, its actions or adversaries' actions in other domains, such as the IED domain, UAVs, missiles, and seeing how what they're saying there might shed light, or how might we expect it to shed light on their behavior in the biological weapons domain. Secondly, we came across some counter-arguments in Iran, and it is important to explore the counter-argument space as much as we can. I mean, we've noted that it is interesting that there is a lot of information coming out of Iran. It's not a completely monolithic state, despite having the title of supreme leader at the helm. But at the same time, it's also worth noting that this state is very capable and is increasingly willing to and is carrying out information suppression campaigns domestically. It is removing blogs. It is cracking down on people who are making counter arguments to these narratives that might fit other motivations. And some of the people, interestingly, involved in those campaigns that Treasury sanctioned months ago are people who are expressing these fears and who are talking about adversarial biological threats, such as Nader Talebzadeh, who's involved in New Horizon organization. And lastly, given that, it's worth conducting a network analysis. Who is expressing fears? Who is advocating for certain behaviors? Where might they overlap in this complex system of overlapping bureaucracies where everyone has a competing interest?